folks, George here. Today we're going to talk about John Rawls and his A Theory of Justice. This is a seminal work in 20th century philosophy. It's created a whole industry such that people agree with it, write so much about it. But by the way, so much of late 20th century political philosophy has also been in response and arguing against John Rawls's theory of justice. That said, why are we talking about what is typically called a political philosophy in what we've called a moral and ethics sort of series? Well, a couple of reasons, right? Is that he is really focused about what is right and wrong. How shall we live our lives and how shall we treat others? Right? He does address some of those questions, I think, especially the how shall we treat others and what is it right to do in our treatment of other people. So that's my slight defense of presenting John Rawls in a ethics and moral philosophy class, yeah? Maybe I've convinced you, maybe I haven't. In any case, here we are talking about John Rawls and his seminal work, A Theory of Justice. To be sure, I'm just talking about a very small portion of it here. So, yeah, let's get right into it then. First, John Rawls is concerned with justice. For John Rawls, justice denies that anyone's freedom can be sacrificed for something like the greater good. So in this way, John Rawls is a direct response, disagreeing with somebody like John Stuart Mill and his utilitarian philosophy, which says the greatest good for the greatest number, or something along those lines, right? The greatest happiness principle is for the greatest good of society. John Rawls is saying you cannot sacrifice one for the greater good. That is anathema to justice, yes? Furthermore, rights are not subject to political bargaining. I can't trade my right to freedom for something else. I think John Rawls famously says you cannot sell yourself into slavery. That's just not allowed in a just society. Yep. John Rawls says the only way to allow for an injustice if it is stopping an even greater injustice. Yes. He reminds us, John Rawls does, that society is filled with conflicting interests. Many people have their own versions of the good life, and many people have the desires for the same limited resources that are within one society. That said, justice, therefore, is about how to figure out and how to solve for all those conflicting interests over limited resources of society that are all being fought for by so many conflicting interests, so many conflicting ideas of the good life. Rawls suggests that justice is to form a well-ordered society. What is a well-ordered society? That seems a little bit complicated, yes? He's going to say a well-ordered society is one where everybody accepts the same principles of justice, and two, a society in which social institutions are in place to satisfy the principles of justice. By the way, Rawls admits that this is rare, and that might even be rare wherever you are watching this from today, including the United States. So what are principles of justice, according to Rawls? Principles of justice are those things that single out the rights and the duties of individuals in determining how to distribute the limited resources within a society. So while Rawls acknowledges there are other needs to society, such as coordination, stability, efficiency, John Rawls's theory of justice is only focused on the justice aspect of society. So he develops his theory as justice as fairness. Justice as fairness. Well, what is justice as fairness? So number one is, justice as fairness, according to Rawls, is going to be a social contract theory of justice. He acknowledges that he's in the tradition of Rousseau, of Kant, of Locke. Because it's a social contract theory of justice, John Rawls acknowledges that he has to address the problems with social contract theories. What are some problems with social contract theories? Well, number one, people say, why should we acknowledge that it's a hypothetical theory? It is, after all, a hypothetical contract. And by the way, still to this day, some people do have this problem with hypothetical social contracts. Yes, I think Dworkin, as for my money, explicated it best when he said hypothetical contract is no contract at all, right? But that's for another, that discussion is for another day, yes? But what does he say about the social contract? Well, although it's hypothetical, he does acknowledge, or he suggests, it's reasonable. Yes? And because it's reasonable, that's why it's acceptable. Because anybody who can reason, especially given what he's going to say about how to reason within this hypothetical social contract theory, justice is fairness, because it's reasonable, he believes everybody can accept it and can accept that it is reasonable and that we should all agree to it. So, being a theory of justice, he is going to suggest that free and rational people would agree with this. Furthermore, not just free and rational, but free and rational and self-interested people will agree with this. I think that's one of the most interesting points for Rawls's theory, is that he acknowledges that we're self-interested. Aren't we self-interested? He's not asking people to do these unreasonable expectations that, oh, we should sacrifice ourselves for the greater good. That's what he's saying is, oh, come on, that's a little bit unreasonable, isn't it? We are self-interested. And so with that in mind, how do you get a self-interested, free, and rational person to agree to some principles of justice? Well, he is going to say we need to give equal liberty to choose your own version of the good life. You shall all choose your own version of the good life, given your own personal self-interests. That said, Rawls's theory is not about different versions of the good life. He's saying you figure out, you choose your version of the good life. Justice isn't about that. Justice is about giving the institutional and governmental framework such that you can choose your own good life, your own version of the good life. We're not going to judge different versions of the good life as long as they're free and rational, right? We'll talk about that in a second. So what is his claim towards rationality? John Rawls says we should reason from something he calls the original position. How do you reason from the original position, according to Rawls? Rawls says that this original position shall be under a veil of ignorance. What shall we be ignorant of in this hypothetical original position? What shall be this veil of ignorance? Well, you shall be ignorant of your own place in society, right? You don't know if you're the top of society. You don't know if you're the bottom of society. You shall remain ignorant of that. Number two, you should be ignorant of your own version of the good life. Do you think practicing this religion is part of the good life, or practicing that religion is part of the good life, or following that pursuit, or following some other field? Rawls is saying you shall be ignorant under this veil of ignorance in the original position. You shall be ignorant in what you consider the good life to be. Number three, he suggests you shall also be ignorant in this veil of ignorance in the original position. You shall also be ignorant of your psychological propensities. What are the kinds of things that you desire that are unique to you? Some of us like certain things, other of us don't like certain things. Great. We shall be ignorant of that, of our psychological propensities in this original position. However, in addition to the veil of ignorance, you shall be a reasonable person. You shall be reasonable. You shall also, again, acknowledge that you are looking out for your own best interest. So imagine being a thinker in this original position where you don't know who you are, you don't know what race you are, you don't know what your place in society is, you don't know what your version of the good life is, you don't know what certain psychological propensities you have, but you are reasonable, and you know that you want the best for yourself. Why does Rawls ask us to reason from such an original position? His conclusion is, whatever you rationally choose as a principle of justice in this hypothetical original position would be fair. It would be fair, wouldn't it? And furthermore, free and equal people would assent to this conclusion, whatever principles of justice you would develop. Nobody, by the way, would choose to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Nobody would say, let me think. I might be this religion, but I don't know that religion. So I don't know if I practice this religion, but maybe we shall discriminate against this group of people. Rawls would say you would never do that because, after all, you are self-interested. Aren't we all self-interested? Don't we want the best for ourselves? That's what a rational person would do. So they wouldn't sacrifice themselves. So just to reiterate, this is clearly an anti-utilitarian argument or an anti-utilitarian position from which Rawls is approaching these questions. So with this original position in mind, John Rawls offers us two principles of justice. Two principles of justice, and they are in order of importance. The first principle is more important than the second principle of justice. Number one, the first principle of justice would be that everybody has equal liberty and equal basic rights. Everybody has equal basic rights. After all, if you didn't know who you were in society from that original position, if you didn't know what your psychological propensities were, if you didn't know what your version of the good life was, if you didn't know what your place in society was, your race, your religion, wouldn't you say that everybody, therefore, shall have equal basic rights? Equal basic rights and duties. Well, what are some of those? Such as freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to other sorts of freedom of movement, let's say. The second principle of justice is much more interesting and a bit more controversial too. He says inequalities in society, especially like inequalities of wealth, are only allowed if they benefit the worst off people in society. So we can only allow inequalities if the bottom of society is actually elevated as a result of inequalities. Now, some people have said, well, that justifies terrible inequalities and things like that. And John Rawls would say, yeah, it does justify inequalities, but only if the bottom people of society are taken care of first, are better off. Let's only look at the bottom of society, not the top. Don't look at who's the richest people. How will the richest people in society benefit? But rather, how will the poorest people in society benefit? If they don't benefit, then there shouldn't be such inequalities. How does that make sense? Well, again, if you're in this original position, you don't know who you are, yet you still want the best for yourself, you might end up being this worst off person in society, right? You might be. You don't know. That's what Rawls has called the maxi-min principle. He wants to maximize the minimum position in society. If in this original position, you don't know if you're the richest person in society or the poorest person, you are going to be cautious and prudent. And so you're going to say, I want the best from this original position. I want to look out for the poorest person in society first. And if there are inequalities, they're only justified if they lift up the lowest person in society. the poorest people, let's say, the most economically disadvantaged in society. By the way, the second principle of justice, this maximin principle, that inequalities are only justified if they benefit the least economically advantaged people in society. He says he justifies it. He says this prevents arbitrary natural endowments from really taking hold in society or other sort of circumstances. So let's reiterate these two principles of justice. The first principle of justice suggests each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties. So equal rights for everybody. The second principle, of course, like I said, it's more controversial, but he even breaks it up into two subparts of the second principle. Economic inequalities are to be arranged so that, number one, they're to everyone's advantage, that they lift up the worst off in society too. But furthermore, the second part of the second principle of justice is such that economic inequalities shall only be allowed if they are attached to positions and offices that are open to all. So something like equal opportunity. By the way, going back to the original position, we see how this makes sense, doesn't it? If you don't know who you are in society, and you say, how shall we allow for inequalities? Shall we allow for inequalities? Right? Your first hunch would be, well, no inequalities at all, especially no inequalities of rights. But what about economic inequalities? Well, economic inequalities if, number one, they help out the worst off in society, and number two, there is equal opportunity for all to become the richest person in society, or something like that, yeah? Now, that said, regarding the first principle, the liberties, equal basic liberties, are not absolute. They're not absolute. However, remember what we said earlier, that if there are freedoms that are taken away, right, injustice can only be allowed to stop a greater injustice, number one. But here he also adds that injustice is only allowed if everybody suffers the injustice equally, right? If only everybody suffers the injustice equally. Now, some people might consider the complications in the political, I don't want to get into this too much, but the political turmoil that happened during the pandemic, the global pandemic, some places really restricted people, right? Restricted liberties, without question. John Rawls might be okay with that to stop a greater injustice, namely the death of everyone. But furthermore, it's only allowed if everybody is subjected to suffering these liberties. If you only get to pick and choose who is under pandemic lockdown, it is unjust to suggest that some people have to be locked down during the pandemic, but other people are allowed to move about freely, right? If everybody suffers the injustices equally, to stop the greater injustice, such that all society, let's say, dies, then it's acceptable to Rawls. Now, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty details about the pandemic and were these injustices necessary or not. That's for a different discussion. But I'm just bringing it up as an example. How Rawls might think about the liberties, taking away liberties during terrible situations. For Rawls, these two principles of justice, the first principle that guarantees equal basic rights to all, and number two, that they provide some sort of equal opportunity to all, such that the worst off in society can become something like the best off in society. Those two principles of justice are presented in serial order. What does that mean for Rawls? When you compare different schemes in societies, the first and most important thing we should look at is that first principle of justice. Are all people given equal basic rights? So when we compare two different societies and we say, well, this society is very good because everybody is rich in this society. However, if, let's say, one segment of that society, namely women, do not have equal rights. Let's say they don't have the right to vote, they don't have free speech. Rawls is going to say, even though everybody in that society is richer, it doesn't matter because they don't succeed in that first principle of justice, which is equal basic rights to all, right? Principle number one is more important than principle number two. Now compare that society where everybody is rich. However, let's say women don't have equal rights. And now compare society number two where women do have equal rights, but everybody's a little poorer off or a bit poorer off. Rawls is going to say that second society that I just described, the one where all people have equal rights, even though they're economically poorer, that society is better. Why? Because that first principle of justice takes priority over the second principle. Now, let's compare two other societies now. To a society where everybody in both societies has equal rights. What is a more just society? Well, Rawls is going to look at the second principle of justice. How are the inequalities, the economic inequalities, weighed in these two societies where everybody has equal basic rights? Well, if there is great inequality in one society, great inequality in this first society, however, the poorest people in the society are well off. Yeah, are well off. Well, the second society has less inequality. They're a bit more economically equal. We're talking about economics now, right? Because the first priority of justice, by the hypothesis of this scenario, is fulfilled in both societies such that everybody has equal rights. So we're only talking about economic inequality. This first society has great inequality, but the poorest people are better off. Now let's look at the second society where there's less inequality, but the poorer people are much poorer than in this first society where there is a great inequality. What's interesting here is Rawls's priority is to look at the worst off in society. That's how you judge the economic justice in some society. Not merely the inequality, but most importantly, look at the worst off in society. And that is going to be very, very interesting. Imagine a society where everybody's economically equal, but everybody's economically equally poor, versus a society with great inequality, but the poorest people in society are much richer than in this very equal society. Well, Rawls is going to say the society with the highest position, or the richest, the most wealthy position of the poorest people, is the more just society. I don't know if you agree with that, but that is Rawls's thinking based on his original position stipulations. Think of yourself, go back to the original position. Think of yourself as not knowing where you are in society, not knowing if you're the richest in society or the poorest. Think about yourself in reasoning from the original position, and you don't know if you are a female or a male, or of this race or that race. Well, what you're going to want is, number one, equal basic rights, and number two, the richest bottom position. The richest bottom position, right? So that I want to be, even if I'm the poorest person in society, I'd rather be a rich, poor person in society than an equal, impoverished person in this society. So Rawls's logic goes, right? If you're in that original position. Of course, like I've said before, this is fairly controversial. What do you think about that? Is that how justice shall be considered? So there are the two principles of justice, and how Rawls reasons to those two principles of justice under his theory of justice. Justice is fairness, yeah? Bye-bye.